Good morning, everybody. It's your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, a wandering author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same. Spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. We are coming at you. It's about 5 o'clock, and I'm at Letchworth State Park in southwestern New York. I will talk about a story that happened to me earlier today. My serpentine belt died, and I found a novel way to overcome that situation. But first, let's talk about this park. Now, I think I'm going to use a thumbnail that I took on a video from earlier today. It's prettier. Right now we're just kind of walking through the woods so I can have some better recording place. But this park is known as the Grand Canyon of the East. It comprises over 14,000 acres. And it is about 17 miles long, and it goes along the Genesee River. I'll upload the other video. It's just me kind of talking about my serpentine belt dying. But you'll see it's a beautiful gorge, and the main topic that we're going to cover today is the American Revolution. I had not written anything for my video today the last time. Basically, this morning I woke up and the AC compressor had a bearing go bad on it, and as a result, the serpentine belt completely snapped and came off my car, meaning the battery died, so I was immobile. Luckily, I had a spare battery, because this isn't the first time my vehicle has had electrical issues. And I was able to get a replacement serpentine belt without getting a new air compressor by getting a shorter one and just bypassing the compressor entirely. So it was only about $20. Anyways, the last time we spoke about American history, we left off with a list of grievances that the American people had suffered at the hands of the British, stuff like the Stamp Act, and then impressment, where they were basically drafted into the Navy for the Brits. And then we talked about the Sons of Liberty with John Adams and how they started to organize actual counter or revolutionary dissent against the British Crown, and how those things culminated in stuff like the Boston Tea Party, where popular revolts and uprisings started to actually occur against Britain. Eventually, in 1776, the Continental Congress met together, and on Independence Day, July 4th, they issued a proclamation declaring independence. That's why it's our Independence Day here in the United States. Now, as soon as this happened, they were at war with the mightiest empire the world had ever seen at the time. And what does any war require? It needs financing, and it needs bodies. So the Continental Congress had to get the average person behind their message of revolution against the crown, and they had to figure out how to logistically make it happen, which is no small feat. Even in the 1700s, that was still quite an accomplishment. So America's revolutionary leaders had to win over the average man's affections, and enthusiasm for war was weak overall. However, the great mass of landowners were all armed, so getting weapons into people's hands wasn't a difficulty because everybody already owned vehicles. Hashtag protect the second. John Adams himself comments on it, and he estimated that 1/3 of the common folk supported revolution against the British, 1/3 opposed it, and 1/3 were neutral. Alexander Hamilton, at the time an aide to George Washington, wrote, quoting, "Our countrymen have all the folly of the ass and all the passiveness of the sheep. They are determined not to be free. If we are saved, France and Spain must save us." So at least some of the leadership was not exactly hopeful about the average American's prospects at the time. Many of the revolutionary soldiers that they were trying to sway were swayed by material gains. They were basically trying to elevate their social status. While the Revolutionary Army's leadership often came from upper middle class backgrounds, the rank and file predominantly hailed from lower down on the socioeconomic ladder. So we're talking about an army led by upper middle class men and filled out by the working class. And the working class were not always in agreement, and oftentimes, like, the effects of the revolution directly hurt them, at least immediately, like short-term gains, right? Now again, I'm totally pro freedom, pro democracy, pro America. But the even at the time, there were mutinies against some of the colonial conscription. Connecticut issued conscription laws that required military service for anyone between the ages of 16 and 60, unless they paid £5, which at the time was quite a bit of money, but that basically makes it, in the video game Final Fantasy Tactics, there's a line where they say if the punishment for a law or breaking a law is a fine, then that punishment only exists for the poor. Now that may just be a video game, but I think the truth of that statement is shown by stuff like that. Some of the working class Pennsylvania people were aware of the hypocrisy. A particular officer in the Pennsylvania militia said, in quotes, "We cannot help observing how similar this conduct is to that of British officers." He was referencing impressment. He's just basically the person doing the impressing switched from Britain to colonial leaders. Which begs the question, does war necessitate hierarchy? Can a decentralized people actually wage a successful war? The Native Americans were relatively decentralized, and we saw how they fared against the colonists, right? And even Jefferson commented on how he felt the Native Americans were happier, even though they lost to the superiority of the Europeans. Ultimately, the American militias lost key battles during the early war at Bunker Hill, Brooklyn Heights, Harlem Heights. The only major win they had at the early phase was one major engagement at Saratoga in New York in 1777. No matter how much the upper middle class leaders tried to get the lower class or working class to be on board, Washington froze with his troops in Valley Forge while awaiting Benjamin Franklin to conclude negotiations with the French monarchs. So this right here was a cool thought. We just talked about with Athens, how Athens got their democracy only after a Spartan king, Cleomenes the First, basically liberated them. And America was kind of liberated by French troops in the Revolutionary War. We wouldn't have won without them. Britain would dominate the war and win one victory after another, particularly in the South, up until the French troops and ships turned the tide. Quote intended, or pun intended. By starving British troops of supplies via naval blockade, French support helped the American Revolutionary Army secure ultimate victory in 1781 at Yorktown. Historian Eric Forner describes the war period as a time of immense profits for some colonists and terrible hardships for others. So again, it's important to remember that even though I'm pro-revolution, I think America deserves to be free, but even during the revolution, that era, there were people who were profiting and people who weren't, who were losing. There were royalists in the colonies, people that wanted to remain part of the king, or part of the British domain, right? And they lost. Inflation hit 45% in a single month, and this started having some newspapers in Pennsylvania were issuing declarations saying that people were going to revolt if they couldn't afford bread. In May of 1779, the first company of the Philadelphia Artillery wrote a petition to the People's Assembly, which was like a colonial governing institution. They write about the troubles of the middling and the poor, promising violence against those who are avariciously intent upon amassing wealth by the destruction of the more virtuous part of the community. Okay, again, 17th century or 18th century English is kind of hard to parse sometimes, but they're basically being like, yo, lower the prices or we're going to kill you. And that's the militia who's supposed to be fighting for independence, right? In October, the Fort Wilson riots highlight these tensions between the have and have-nots. A militia group marched into the house of a wealthy lawyer named James Wilson and demanded he institute price controls after James Wilson's votes were against them previously. This militia, the members of the Continental Congress, were all linked together, the people who were leading the revolution, by businesses and family connections. And on New Year's Day in 1780. Dude, look at this bug that just landed on me. In 1781, Pennsylvania troops near Morristown, New Jersey, execute their officer mutiny and begin marching on the Continental Congress. George Washington ends up intervening in this and actually negotiates their surrender and convinced Congress to remain in Philadelphia instead of calling off the revolution. Why were these soldiers mutinying? Shortly after, a contingent from the New Jersey line mutinied, but Washington disarmed them by force to make an example. So there was discontent in the revolutionary forces. Some of the people, like the farmers, would be upset whenever they realized that as a private they were only getting paid $6.66 per month, per month. But the upper middle class people who could enroll in as colonels or officers got paid $75 a month. Kind of unfair. Civilian resistance in the colonies would force some concessions by the revolutionary government. So it was hard for the warriors to resist, but the people that were the civilians did resist the colonial, like the revolutionary government in a lot of ways. A rebellion of freeholders in Maryland was subdued after the governor rearranged the tax code. Basically, the people refused to pay their taxes unless he started taxing slaves more, and like people with estates worth more than 5,000 pounds, which was a huge amount. Basically, the people organized against the ultra wealthy of Maryland, which is funny because I was just in Maryland, and it's the kind of place I would imagine back in the day would have been very wealthy. I'm not sure, but that thought just crossed my head when I was driving through there. Another interesting thing is many of the early colonies and like early states at this point had property qualifications and income qualifications for holding office. So like in Maryland, you could not become the governor unless you earned more than 5,000 pounds a year, and that immediately disqualified 90% of the population from running. The only state or colony that's going to completely abolish these kind of qualifications during this era is Pennsylvania, which does completely abolish the property and income qualifications for holding office. Another thing that we see from the civilians as they resist revolution is tenant revolts, which become increasingly threatening in the midst of war. There's a lot more that we could go into, so we'll finish up with the conclusion of the revolution the next time we touch on American history. But a few takeaways. One of them I kind of mentioned already. Athens owes their democracy to a Spartan king. America kind of owes our democracy to a French monarch. Interesting how history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it certainly rhymes. The people were divided the whole time. There were definitely revolutionaries in the U.S. From all social classes, but they were also dissenters from all social classes.